Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. New polling shows that Vice President Kamala Harris is gaining ground with Latino voters. Here to explain what that means and what it means for the election is María Teresa Kumar. She's the co-founder and CEO of Voto Latino. María Teresa, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks for having me and for having the timely conversation that this is.
When it's an election season, there is polling every day of the week. But let's start with the polling that we saw just the other day. What do we know about our two presidential candidates and how they are resonating with Latino voters?
So, Maggie, the best thing to do is to explain a little bit of what happened before there was a swap of the Democratic nominee. Leading up to that swap, we had in key battleground states, the Latino vote, 59% for Biden and 38% for Trump. However, the moment that you introduced a third party candidate, that support for Biden dropped to 47%, with an overwhelming 17% going for third party. And this is what surprised us at Voto Latino. We've been doing this for 20 years. 62% of women under the age of 40 were considering voting for a third party. And that's what I said. Wow. And we didn't expect it because all the headlines are that Latinos were defecting to the Republican side and that it was being led by Latino men. In fact, it was the women looking for other options. Since Kamala Harris has been swapped out, not only do we see an enthusiasm of expanding the voter base at Voto Latino, but equally as important, we are seeing people that were at 17% third party down to 8% in a place like Nevada, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. In fact, some of the polling that we did, we found that in 2020, Biden was at a 50% support rate in August. Harris, out of the gate, was at 67% by the Latino community. And since she went from the second to the top of the ticket, we have seen over a 200% increase in our voter registration. So we have now registered over 86,000 voters. Of that, 65% of them are under the age of 25, and 60% of them are women. To give you an idea, in Arizona, Biden won that state by 10,400 votes. As of today, we have already registered over 11,700. So we've already registered over his margin of victory just in Arizona alone.
Wow. So that's a significant change in engagement, significant change in the numbers. I'm wondering, just to pull back and to put into further context with 2020, 2016, 2008, what is the traditional number or percentage that a presidential candidate must win among Latino voters to win the presidency?
It really depends on the state, obviously, but in a place even like Georgia, you needed at least a threshold of at least 60%. And Biden got that. Among young voters, he got 70% when it came to key battleground states. And right now, not only is Kamala Harris tracking that, but she's doing so intergenerationally. And another thing that we found really interesting in the recent polling that we found is that Latina women in particular, wholeheartedly in her camp. They have no question that she could be an excellent president. They identify and they see themselves in that. And the reason I say that is that that was not necessarily the case at this point in time during the Hillary Clinton campaign. So it's a very different, program that we're seeing and enthusiasm. Part of it is I think that there's been more socialization in the last almost 8 years of women leadership, of heightened attention and understanding of the barriers that women face. And also, I think, a very clear understanding that she is defining herself in spaces that people are trying to tell her that she should not belong to. And there's not a woman among us that has not heard that before.
That's interesting. You see across the political landscape signs that folks have learned from prior election cycles. We see the big Zoom fundraising, and I do not remember that in 2000 ever. It does feel unprecedented. Now, of course, Latinos are not a monolith. So are you focusing your efforts on engaging in certain states or specific demographics? Can you talk about the work that you're doing to register voters and where you're going?
Excellent question. So back in 2010, I'm going to take you back over a decade. We learned that Latinos were the second largest demographic in the country. we had basically been responsible for 52% of our growth according to the census, but the majority of us were under 18 years old. So at Voto Latino, we identified the 8 key battleground states: Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Florida. And I point to North Carolina and Georgia because in 2010, everybody said that we were wasting our time. But 2 things we knew. In Georgia, for example, Latinos were 2% of the electoral base, but they were over 16% of the kids in classrooms. So we knew that they were going to age in. So in Georgia today, Latinos are 5% of the electoral base. They're 20% of the classrooms. And so what we see is if you focus on young Latinos and you increase that electoral base, they are the ones that will flip elections. They're the ones that have to get in the game. And by default, the way most campaigns run their program is that they focus only on high propensity voters. Because 60% of Latino voters are under the age of 40, most of them don't have a voting history. So our program is all about education, registration, engagement, and mobilization of low propensity voters, the people that are disregarded by the majority of elections and the system. But at the end of the day, that helped flip Colorado, Georgia, makes North Carolina purple, Texas purple, flipped Arizona, and is going to flip basically protect Pennsylvania and Wisconsin.
We've seen Vice President Harris campaigning in some of those Sunbelt states that you just referenced. And we've also seen former President Trump campaigning in Nevada and touting policies like no tax on tips. And that indicates to me that the electoral map could look a little different this year. So you mentioned those 8 states back in 2010. What is your focus today? Are you considering any of these swing states lost causes? Are you still looking at all 8? What's the 2024 thinking?
That is an excellent question. I have to share with you that before Kamala Harris was at the top of the ticket, there were rumblings among the progressive left and the Democratic Party not to pay attention to Nevada, that Arizona was going to be tight, but let's focus only on the blue wall. That has never been our thinking. One of the things that we know is that while people poll and say that they may be interested in Republican ideology, the way they actually vote is very different. What we were concerned with is that not that they were going to flip to Republicans, but what we were very concerned with is that they were going to stay home. And that was why third party for us was literally alarm bells going off. When Trump says that he talks about no tax on tips, there's an incredible effort right now by the unions to talk about what that really means, because it actually lowers their ability to actually get the fair wages. And something that's really interesting in Nevada as well is that one of the first things that the Trump campaign did when they changed their leadership, when Rhonda McDonald was out the door and Laura Trump went on, basically took took the helm, is that they shuttered their offices in Nevada. They shuttered their offices, their Latino offices outreach in Nevada and Pennsylvania and so forth. What that tells me is that when you're not raising the money that you need, and when you have to be very efficient with your resources, you look at your balance sheet and say what programs are not performing to where they're supposed to, and you zero them out. So one of the first programs they zeroed out was outreach to the Latino community. That tells me that it wasn't working. When they got the headlines and realized that that was a bad headline, they reopened it, but it's absolutely not to the level at what they had before.
That's so interesting. And you also mentioned in talking about the voters that you're engaging a short, if any, voting history. So as you're engaging them, what are the issues? What are the policies that you're finding that they tell you they care about the most?
I'm going to give you anecdotally what we saw in our focus groups that translated to actual polling. We had a young man who was 22 years old, baggage claim, worked at the baggage claim in Phoenix Airport, and he told us that housing was his number one issue. I will tell you, Maggie, that when he said that, we assumed that it was because he was living with his parents or that he was aspiring to buy a house someday. No, when we dug in deeper, he said housing is the number one issue because I have to figure out how to budget myself to figure out if I could have 1 meal or 2 meals a day. So when we say that housing is a big deal, that means that we're talking about making ends meet at the very fundamental level. The response that we received from young Latinos 18 to 29, not only was housing a number one issue, 35% of them had gone on public assistance and 22% of them had gotten a second job. These are issues that we historically hear from single mothers in their 30s, not a 22-year-old. So by all means and purposes, this young man and this generation has played by the rules, done everything right, and are basically scraping by. And so that was the number one issue. The two issue was abortion. Prior to Harris being on top of the ticket, it was a resounding big issue, but none of the people that we spoke to, nor on our surveys, could tell you which party was responsible for taking away the right and access to abortion. Remember, Maggie, these are low propensity, low information voters. And so the moment that Kamala got on top of the ticket, the same voters knew exactly about abortion and knew that she was on their side.
That's really interesting. And not to give away the House secrets, but then how are you educating this constituency? Because you just said they're low information, low propensity. Is it engaging on TikTok? Are you implementing new outreach efforts this year that you hadn't in prior cycles?
So the fun thing, and I think the biggest kept secret about Voto Latino, and not such a big secret, is that we're digital natives. So when I co-founded Voto Latino, I didn't have access to capital or really a network. So I funded Voto Latino from the beginning on my credit card. And said, okay, how do I reach the masses? And believe it or not, we were on MySpace, and that's how we started. And so we actually talk to our young people online all the time, but because we're digital natives. And so, we've graduated from MySpace to TikTok to Instagram to YouTube, but we're always there and always talking. When we first started, we worked very closely with bloggers, and then we went work radio DJs, and now we're working with influencers. And we've already enlisted close to over 100 influencers that are going to be communicating a lot of these messages for us on our behalf. Because one of the things that has always been a cornerstone of Voto Latino is that, yes, we're digital natives, but at the end of the day, it's the peer-to-peer conversations that move young people and the Latino community. That has always been authentic and organic. And so among this community, we have 70% brand recognition between 17 and 29-year-olds, and they trust that we're shepherding them into the right process. And what I'm really proud of is of the 650,000 folks that we registered in the last cycle, 82% went out and voted. So 8 out of 10 voted compared to 6 out of 10 for the industry average. And so they hear from us all the time. Right now, just organically sitting here since January, we reached over 46 million people, all through the social media platforms. And because they're sharing the work that we're doing, we're sharing the information. Come September, we'll be running basically a 44 million paid media and on the ground campus campaign so that we can talk to them about the issues they care about, the information they need, and so they actually can cast that ballot. But we deeply believe in information and intervention, meaning that we at the same time are countering disinformation that they're hearing, whether it's you can vote on Wednesday, whether you can register to vote and not show up, to basically a more nefarious activity that we find online.
When you talk about the issues that you've heard in your focus group, you mentioned housing and abortion. And of course, we see the economy being a huge issue for voters of all political leanings. And I think that's probably why we've seen the no tax on tips support from both candidates. And this week we saw Vice President Harris come out with a policy. There was a headline on Forbes.com about a $25,000 benefit for first-time and first-generation home buyers. She's also come out against price gouging and price surging at the grocery store. A lot of this is very new within the last 24 to 48 hours. But Maria Teresa, what do you know that your constituency is saying about this? Have you heard any early reaction about whether this is resounding with them or if it's just missing the mark?
The $25,000 for first-time home buyers, what folks don't realize that Latinos are basically a generation and a half different and younger than the white community. So the average white voter is roughly 45 years old. The Latino community is roughly 31 years old. And so they're starting this aspiration. So this idea of saying, I see where you are and where you want to get to. The $25,000 is really an aspirational move on her part, saying, look, I know that the American dream is very embedded on her first-time buyers. I also recognize that you might be strapped with student loans. Well, we're taking care of that. Now we're opening the door for step 2. I also, the price gouging resonates not just with Latinos, but overwhelmingly with young people. When they went to task with Ticketmaster, everybody thought that that was, a nice to have. For young voters, it's like I have to pinch my pennies when they're telling people that when they're flying that they're all of a sudden going to get reimbursement from the airlines. These are things that oftentimes people of higher incomes take for granted. But if you talk to the majority of young people, if you talk to people that really have to balance a budget because they are trying to figure out how they're going to eat, $5 back in your pocket, $20 back in your pocket, having insulin all of a sudden that you no longer have to pay $2,000 out of pocket, but only $35, these add up to basically saying we are committed to a thriving middle class. And there's certain items that, because they have not had oversight, have gone runaway. And so we're trying to basically bring in the reins of corporations so that they are playing fairly. I also, one of the things that they don't talk about enough, but I think it's going to be part of her second part of her agenda, is that the Republicans are going to try to frame her as anti-business. And I would say that she's anti-big business, but she's very much a small business capitalist, because they understand that it's small business that is the economic engine of Main Street. They're the ones that are, Latinas specifically are the fastest purveyors of small businesses. So it speaks to them and meeting them where they are, but at the same time recognizing that they're the largest employers outside of the federal government. And so you want to make sure that they're thriving.
It's a huge constituency. We've written a lot about that at Forbes. But I also want to ask, among the Latino community, there are, of course, folks who have immigrated from countries where socialist policies are not popular. And you have some reporting that's come out indicating that former President Trump is using the word communist in reference to Vice President Harris. Is that enough to depress turnout or to depress sentiment among certain Latino voters, given a perhaps prior experience?
This is where the idea of where Latinos are not a monolith actually resonates. So the majority of folks that have fled socialism and communism are in Florida. And so that idea, unless there's a counter narrative, which is like, no, but we're with you for small business. We want you to thrive. That's where it really grasps the imagination. And quite frankly, that was an unforced error for the Biden campaign in 2020, because they basically said, looked at Florida, it's like, who's going to believe that? Well, if you don't have a counter to what you mean and what your policies are, and they're going to make you to thrive, then you leave a vacuum for interpretation. The difference, though, is that if you look at the majority of Latino voters, the majority of them are Mexican American. They didn't flee a government. They fled, they're economic refugees. They fled lack of opportunity when it came to business, when to basically making their needs met. So it's a very different conversation, and that's why when you look at the socialist conversation, it sort of stops it sort of stops right now in Florida. Now, if you don't have a counter argument in about 5 to 10 years when you're talking to Venezuelans, then it will resonate. But right now, outside of that pocket of that state, it really doesn't resonate anywhere else because there's no life experience to show that.
That makes sense. Now, of course, another issue that we've seen from Gallup surveys is immigration as a whole. Voters are concerned. Does Voto Latino have a policy platform or recommendation on that? What are you hearing from your community when it comes to American immigration policy?
So I think what we have gone down a route where we have merged two very distinct issues. There is an immigration crisis that is happening and alleviated now more at the border, but that has root causes in the Western Hemisphere that need to be addressed. And you have seen the vice president when she convinced business to invest close to $5.5 billion in Central America to generate business and jobs and what have you. That was her effort to address the migration issue. We still need to come up with a Western Hemispheric issue where we bring in Canada, we bring in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and talk about what are we going to do? For the last 45 years, the United States, we've abandoned our neighbors to the south. And if we can frame it as how do we fortify our neighbors, and also frame it as this is a national security issue because Russia and China are absolutely investing in South America, then it allows us to actually have a more frank conversation with Congress. The second part, and this is where it becomes very relatable to Latino voters and, believe it or not, independent white voters. How do you talk to individuals and protect individuals that have been in our country for 20, 30 years? And we saw the Biden administration take the first steps by providing visas to spouses of American citizens who had been here for at least 10 years. Latino voters want to protect their families. In fact, that is the number one reason why they jumped in the game. It's the number one reason why they started participating in Arizona, because we had Sheriff Arpaio. And sadly, in all the states that we're in, we've had a version of Sheriff Arpaio and Show Me Your Paper laws. And that's the catalyst for Latinos to protect themselves with the vote and their families. But the other thing that we saw was that independent white Americans in the same states, a resounding 76% of them, also believe that if you had a spouse that's lived here for at least 10 years, paid their taxes, and is right by the law, that they also should receive protection. Why? Because that individual could be your children's teacher, it could be your clergy, it could be your spouse.
That is very true. So what is the immigration policy that you most want to see from either the Harris or the Trump campaign? Does either candidate meet you and your community where you are and what you want to hear?
That's a great question, Maggie. I think that one is we do need to solve the immigration of the folks that have been here for a very long time. That should be the first order of business. In part, it's because 16 million Americans have a loved one that is living in the shadows who are paying taxes, who are part of our community. We need to solve for them. And then we need to have a very frank conversation with the American people that we need to invest in Latin America, because if we don't, the Russians and the Chinese are. And they're doing it through nefarious activity, whether it's undermining our, our prestige in the international order, whether it's making sure that they are propping up disinformation, creating chaos, and putting unfriendly, non-democratic governments in their place. This is a very different world order, and we have to make sure that we're speaking very clearly at what the risks are. So for Harris and Walz, I would encourage them to have that conversation, that we do need to invest in the Western Hemisphere, but that we also need to safeguard the domestic policy issue of the folks that are here, that are part of our communities. On the Trump side, it's tough. I will tell you that Voto Latino, RC4, we had never endorsed a presidential candidate until 2020. And that is because of the work that we did on the border. I saw the families that were torn apart firsthand. I heard of the stories, our volunteers going into deep Texas, trying to door knock, only to find whole swaths of communities completely emptied, because oftentimes immigration would raid a family, take away a parent, and leave a child behind. That is not who we are. But what the former President Trump is providing and suggesting of mass deportation, that is going to be a dragnet that is not just an immigration policy, but that is going to ensure that U.S. citizens also get caught up. Because it's not enough to say that you know what an undocumented person looks like simply because of what they wear, what they look like, or even their accent. Under his administration, there were dozens of US citizens that got caught up in detention and then had to go prove that they were in fact American citizens. And so this idea of mass deportation, frankly, I think is an unforced error on his part, because what he does not understand is that if you were to look at school children in kindergarten right now, a quarter of them, the largest portion of Americans that are kindergarten, are of mixed race. So imagine being a white father with your Asian American son being pulled aside in kindergarten by a school administrator asking them if they're American. That is terrifying. There's not anyone I know that actually wants to have their children go through that experience.
You mentioned earlier in this conversation that we're kind of in the first inning here, especially as we just really had the change in the Democratic candidate just a few weeks ago. And so there's still a lot of voter education that remains. What does the second inning look like? What is your plan for the next 80 or fewer days?
Well, first of all, the surge that we've seen in voter registration, we expected the surge to come after Labor Day. We are already 20% of our goal. And it is exciting because the goal is to register 500,000 voters in key battleground states and mobilize 3.2 million low propensity voters. I deeply believe, Maggie, that if we love our democracy, what she needs is nurture. And the more people that participate in our elections, it tones down the political rhetoric on both sides, and it forces to bring in people that will get the business of government to work. And frankly, so many of us are still recovering from the pandemic. So many of us are still dealing, whether it's with health issues, financial issues, what have you. We need people in place to address those issues. And so our job between now and the election is to inform voters how to participate, making sure that they are registered, even if they voted last time, because there's a massive effort to kick people off the voting rolls. And at the end of the day, making sure that they vote. Because I deeply believe that once people are informed, they're engaged, our democracy thrives, but it has to be a continued effort of information in a space where there's constant targeting of disinformation.
Well, I look forward to checking in with you in a month or two to see how that effort is going. But in the meantime, María Teresa Kumar of Voto Latino, thank you so much for your time today. We so appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much for the conversation, Maggie.